Well, um, welcome everyone. We'll be starting soon. Welcome, welcome. Feel free to write in the chat where you're coming from, where you're joining in from. Someone says Fortnite, cool. What countries is everyone joining from? Or where are you now? Awesome. So we have some viewers from London and other places. Awesome. Viewers from the US. My name is Donata and I'm in London at the moment, and we're just going to get started in one moment. Or from Manila, we got someone from the Philippines joining. UK, France, we have all sorts of countries coming up. Awesome. Wow, Guatemala. Wow. So cool. So we're just going to get started in about 30 seconds. So Turkey, I'm seeing Florida, USA, Philippines. Wow, really awesome. Awesome. I think I'm going to get started. Um, just to introduce again, my name is Donata Miller, and I'm a curator here in London. I'm based in London, and I mainly work in museums. And my work is interested in revealing more information about artworks and the connections between communities and artworks. Today, our topic is art influencing the West, focusing on Africa and Oceania. And I'm going to go through about 40 minutes. I'm going to try and make it as short and sweet as possible, but just giving a little bit of an overview of the connections between Western artists and some of the art they've been influenced by, and some artists that we know their name, but haven't necessarily seen the things that they are influenced by or given those the platform that they deserve. Cool. So I'm just going to start off by saying that, global communication did not begin in the 19th century, and that so much happened prior to the height of the international slave trade and other things that we've come to know as the movements, the globalization movements. Um, Prior to the 19th century, there was a focus on representation and adherence to classical forms in artwork, but at the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century, we saw a move away from some of the more classical ways of doing art. And we'll look at that through artists like Picasso and Gauguin today. The effects of colonialism cannot be undermined when speaking about this topic, and it runs throughout the whole conversation that we have today, whether looking at Picasso's work or looking at Modigliani's work. And also, I just wanted to point out before we start that there's an importance. We mentioned a lot of big names, and that someone's authored, like Picasso. We mentioned those big names, but there's a lot of artists who are unauthored, and there's many reasons why artists can be unauthored. They can be from groups that do work together or tribes that do work together. They can be that when it was taken to Western countries, that there wasn't enough provenance done, so people didn't record the names of who created it and things like that. So there's a wide variety of reasons why we might not know the artist's name, but their artwork still exists. And we can still lift up an artist whose name we don't know in the same way that we herald the great Western artists that we'll be beginning to look at today. So, to get started, so we're going to start with masks, and I'm going to go through two main themes in this talk: masks and bodies. And I'm going to start off with the influence of masks and Picasso. This is a self-portrait by Pablo Picasso from 1907, and it's an oil on canvas. Uh, Pablo Picasso, just to give an introduction to him, his father was a painter. He was from Malaga, Spain, and he later moved to France. He's a pioneer of Cubism, and we will see some of his kind of Cubist uh, tendencies coming out in the next artwork that we look at. And he's known for his periods. So he's known for the periods such as the Blue period, the Rose period, and even his African period, which we're going to focus on today. So this is a self-portrait on the screen. Does anyone perhaps know how old Picasso is in this self-portrait? He drew portraits from when he was young until he was in his 90s. Can anyone hazard a guess to when at this what age he was in this portrait? If we have any responses. If not, I can let everyone know. So in 1907, he was 25 years old. So this is a self-portrait of Picasso at 25 years old. Oh, I see some coming in now, 20, 35. So it's kind of like a mix of those two. He was 25 and he'd actually moved to Paris a few years earlier. Um, and at this point in 1907, he was in need of inspiration and wanting to do something new. So he was in these artistic circles in France and friends with Henri Matisse. And Henri Matisse showed Picasso a mask made by the Dan tribe of the Ivory Coast. And here we have some Dan tribe masks. There's a Dan Dingle mask from Ivory Coast from Brooklyn Museum. And on the right, we can see a Dan mask uh, from that's at the Africa Museum at the moment. And I've tried to put the names of where the objects I'm taking pictures are from, so you can go and look at those afterwards if you'd like. But especially with the Africa Museum Dan mask, you can really see um, the strong connection to his self-portrait and the kind of big eyes and the longer nose, the lips that form between the portrait and this Dan mask from, the Dan culture in Ivory Coast. So Henri Matisse showed Picasso that mask, and he wasn't an instant convert to African art. He actually did a visit to the Trocadero Museum of Ethnology, which is now the Musée de la Homme in France. And that was when real inspiration hit. So I'm going to just read a bit from him speaking about his experience going to that museum, seeing the African art and how that transformed the way that he painted from then onwards. Uh, so uh, he said, when I went for the first time at Andre Duran's urging to the Trocadero Museum, the smell of dampness and rot there stuck in my throat. It depressed me so much I wanted to get out fast, but I stayed and studied. Men had made those masks and other objects for a sacred purpose, a magic purpose, as a kind of meditation between themselves and the unknown hostile forces that surround them in order to overcome their fear and horror by giving it a form and image. He says, at that moment, I realized what painting was all about. Painting isn't an aesthetic operation. It's a form of magic designed to be a mediator between this strange, hostile world and us, a way of seizing power by giving form to our terrors as well as our desires. When I came to that realization, I knew I'd found my way. Then people began to look at those objects in terms of aesthetics. So here we have uh, Picasso himself talking about the inspiration of visiting that Trocadero museum, and in that moment realizing what painting is all about, and that really shifting the way that he was to work from then onwards and to start his Africa period. A great work that shows this influence is this work, the Young Women of Avignon, or Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, by Picasso, also 1907. And this is at MoMA. And for this artwork, just to give an introduction, it's named after a street in Barcelona that was known for its brothels, and it was a street that Picasso had himself frequented. It features five naked women. It has an Iberian influence. So the women, I'm going to use my mouse. I think you can see my mouse. The women here on the left, the three women, they have more of an Iberian influence in their facial structure, and Iberia is like um, an area including Spain, so a culture that Picasso was more familiar with. But also we can see an African art influence here as well, through these faces. And just to go into a little bit more detail of these women, and to also point out that there's fruit here as well. You can see a melon on the table, and it shows the experience, um, kind of walking into a prostitution scene. Initially, from the sketches and the drawings, um, that this was going to be a medical student walking into this scene with the prostitutes, but he felt that that story took away from the painting too much. So in the end, that turned to a fifth woman. But here we can see these African mask influence, and also this is known as one of Picasso's pioneering Cubist drawings, also paintings. One that inspired him to pioneer Cubism and create more work in that same way. And here's a African mask that gives that detail to show the kind of influences that Picasso was seeing at that time. So yeah, they're inspiring each other, and we see that here in this image. This is also a mask from the African Museum collection. So Picasso wasn't the only one who was being inspired in this way and being inspired by African masks. It must be noted that along with the Trocadero Museum, there was lots of other museums in France and other places in Europe that were bringing over masks and other artifacts also from Oceania and from Africa, maybe from their colonized countries, but also from many other places elsewhere. Bringing them back to France, bringing them to museums, bringing them to museums that we know in the UK, um, and to France and other locations. So we see them there. And yeah, this is Amedeo Modigliani, um, and it's Jean Hebertine with hat and necklace, and it was made in 1917. And Jean Hebertine was a French painter and artist herself, and she was also Modigliani's partner and muse, as he created over 80 works that include her. His work is known to be sometimes haunting, as it doesn't include eyes all the time, and the the people that feature in his work have these longer, drawn out faces. But this is all really connected to him being inspired by African artwork. Um, and it runs throughout his work, the kind of elongated faces, the elongated noses, and looking back at the Dan tribe masks, we can see um, where the influences would have come from. But there's really so many other masks from different places. The the mask that I showed on the screen before was from Congo. There's just so many masks from different places that really um, bring that inspiration to light. We also see here there's a woman's head by Amedeo Modigliani from 1912 that has that same effect, and it being a sculpture brings that African mask element to life even more, because you can see the kind of profiles that you would usually see in an African mask shown here in this bust of a woman. So we have this work also odalisque. So there's two odelisks here. One is Odalisque Harmony in Red by Henri Matisse, which is 1926 to 27, and then we also have Odalisque with Tambourine Harmony in Blue by Matisse, which is from 1926. And it's really interesting to see these artworks. And so we've looked at Picasso and his use of masks and his use of faces. Now we go to Henri Matisse, who inspired Picasso to begin to look into African art. And we see his depictions of North African women here with the odalisque. Odalisque means like servant. The word means servant, or maid. The word comes from maid. So it's not the name of the woman, but it's showing maybe the type of woman in this portrait. And we see these like languishing women or women laying down and the opulence, and it's got that feel of Turkey and countries like that where people were looking for like an oriental Orient experience when they visited there. And Henri Matisse was um, no different with that. He was really interested in African art, but also depicting women in this kind of way. And this kind of introduces the um, use of the body that I want to talk about a bit more as we go throughout this presentation. We see the women here, but they don't have names. We see them through Henri Matisse's eyes in a very sexualized way. Um, they're they're in that kind of servitude, enslavement position as odalisque, um, but without tops and without yeah, without the kind of Jean Hebertine kind of named presence that we see with other portraits of Western women during the time. Just wanted to highlight that quickly. And the work also of Andre Duran. So, does anyone know what this piece by Andre Duran is called? Can anyone hazard a guess? I'll leave a moment. So this piece is called The Dance by Andre Duran. Oh, perfect. Yes, Autumn has it. It's The Dance, and it was made in 1906, and it reflects his Fauvist style and his interest in African art here. And he's showing the woman and their bodies again in this kind of hyper colorful, hyper Fauvist way. To move on to Gauguin. So we just looked at Andre Duran and his use of the body. We see his use of the body through the dance and use of colors. And that was 1906. But before Picasso's work that we looked at of the young woman, or before the work of Modigliani, and before the work of Andre Duran, we have Paul Gauguin, who moved to Tahiti in the 1890s and really took inspiration from the inhabitants, the landscape, and the culture to create his work and to create artwork that combined European themes and also Polynesian law or Polynesian traditions in the artwork. Uh, the picture on the left, the portrait on the left, is of Paul Gauguin's wife, Tehemana, um, during his first visit to Tahiti in 1891 to 1893. And Paul Gauguin had an interesting upbringing as well. He grew up at some parts in Peru and traveling the world. So he was well traveled and felt quite, I think, frustrated by just being in French societies or being in societies. He wanted to be living in Polynesia or to be living somewhere where he saw that kind of racial difference and saw the difference in the people. Um, and he wanted to see that difference even if it wasn't there. So in the case of Tehemana and his moving to Tahiti, at that time Tahiti was heavily controlled by the French colonialist government, and there's mentions of the capital city being almost just like France because that's how deeply France had infiltrated into Tahiti. Um, and we see some of this infiltration in Tehemana has many parents or the ancestors of Tehemana through Tehemana's dress, which is a type of colonial dress that would have been given by missionaries during that period of time. So it's quite austere. It covers all the way to the arms, all the way down. Um, but then he's also included other elements that are really worth noting. So, referring to the ancestors, he's got the picture of one of the ancestral figures in the background. Um, and in Tehumana's hair, she's got this austere dress on. She's got this dress that's covering her in a very like Catholic Christian way, but he's put flowers in her hair that really represent desire for him. So show that he's not just looking at her or just taking a portrait in this way of in this austere way, but instead looking at her with desire and looking at the woman with a lens of desire. And then also in the background is an Easter Island script. So it has nothing to do with Tahiti or Tehumana, but uh, it's the word that's used within art terms is like primit, privatism, sorry, primitism. Um, and there's also mention of primitive art when it comes to African and Oceanian art. Many other art forms were considered primitive art for a long time, and then they were taken out of that category. But it shows the lack of acknowledging African and Oceanian art's presence and heft by it remaining in that primitive art sphere. And with primitivism, um, uh, Gauguin is not only interested in Oceanian art, but also interested in his own projection of what he thinks Oceanian art should look like, what he thinks Oceania um, should look like as a continent, what Tahiti should look like for him as a French man with power, prestige during the period as an artist. So we see some of his desire and all of that reflected through the oil paintings that he produced. And on the right, we have Femme de Tahiti sur la plage by Paul Gauguin, also from 1891. And this is from the Musée d'Orsay collection. And it shows Paul Gauguin's wife again on the left, sitting down with the red skirt, and another woman. And we see again these long dresses that are covering the women. Um, it it must be noted that the way he's drawing them, he's drawn their full lips, he's drawn their full noses. Um, there's a way of drawing that is quite, or sorry, there is a way of painting that is quite interesting. Um, but it must be acknowledged in terms of the harm that Paul Gauguin did also, burying several women and having concubines in Tahiti, and really throwing around his heft as a French colonialist, and using that to his his benefit to marry teenagers and really do some horrible things in Tahiti, even if he has managed to capture features that even in recent years, artists often struggle to capture Black features and to capture Oceanian features in the way that they deserve to be captured. Western artists, I'll say, or artists not from those backgrounds. So there's a complex kind of um, balance going on there. And that is mentioned also with this work. Let me move this page over a sec. So I just want to show this picture. So we have the artist here, Aurelia Durand, and she's speaking about Paul Gauguin's work and how that inspired her, and yet is problematic at the same time. So this is just a story from her Instagram. She speaks about it being revolutionary, the way that he was drawing women of color, and illustrating them and the colors that he used. Um, and that for her, as an artist growing up, she actually looked at his work and at one point really found it inspiring. But it is a complicated story, and his work is a complicated story. And we can see between um, the images of Paul Gauguin on the slide before, and Aurelia Durand's work here. She's a French, she's a Belgian artist. Um, we can see that kind of appreciation for fuller features, and for colors, and some of the things that Paul Gauguin uh, made famous or was pioneering as he was working. So I'll just take this one away. So we have Paul Gauguin, we have Aurelia Durand. So we're moving into this kind of contemporary response to the historical now, because it's all well and good looking at Picasso and it's all well and good looking at Modigliani. But I think it's really interesting also to problematize those artists, and to one way of problematizing them is often using contemporary artists look at their work, and comment on their work and give us different uh, viewpoints from which to see Picasso and other artists through. This work by Yinka Shonibare, who's a British Nigerian artist, was inspired by Picasso and relates to Picasso, and it's called The African Spirits of Modernism. So relates to the earlier quote that I read out about spirits and modernism, and Picasso's experience when walking through the Trocadero Museum. The show explored the legacy of African aesthetics, and for Shonibare, he speaks about it being so he says, in my view, the African contribution to modernism has never really been celebrated in the way it ought to be. So this is true through Picasso's work. So although he spoke about the influence of the Trocadero Museum, at other times he's said really derogatory things about African art, and not always calling it African art, or seeing it as separate and not as high of an art form as the art that he himself produced. But as we saw with the young woman image that inspired Cubism and was actually, even when it was shown in 1916, 1917, when that was shown for the first time, uh, it really caused a ruckus. when it was shown. So uh, his work became was inspiring people even years after he'd created it, and it had that African influence so strongly. It was something so unique and something that people weren't used to, that even 10 years later when he was showing it, it was really shocking to people. um, we can see that influence of African sculptures. So African sculpture influencing Picasso's work, and now Picasso's work influencing Yinka Shonobare's use of tapestry and sculpture here. So there's hidden meanings behind the work. He actually did studies of African art from Picasso's collection. So we have a tapestry here on the left, and on the right, we have Yinka Shonobare's hybrid sculptures. And through this, he's taken the African mask, the African face, but also combined it with a different body, or a, a sculptural body that is more familiar within the West. So he's got the centaur. On the left, he's got the Sphinx, which I'd say is also North African, um, in the middle, and then he's got the Pan kind of trickster figure on the right. So it's about reappropriating for him and taking back um, what has been used so freely by artists that we've looked at earlier, taking that back and reclaiming it as an African work. And by covering the sculptures with African print also, he does this in double fold, giving them an African mask as a face, but also giving them African print as their body. And it's important to also think about Africa and Oceania, but this really stretches to many different countries and continents across the world. Um, this show is on at the moment at Tate Liverpool for people who are in the UK. But more interestingly, they have an online catalogue that brings together the different objects that are in the show. And it's a show that's about rethinking inspirations between different culture, and where is that line between inspiration um, and appropriation, and discussing those topics. So the work that can be seen on the left is by Patissa Abad from the Philippines, and it's of a European mask from 1990. And Patissa Abad uses these masks to reveal this kind of African, the African influences behind the European work, and then to call it a European mask after that. It's exploring this diverse history of countries being influenced and impacted by one another, but also the different colors that are used by her. And there's a really great article that goes into more detail on the European mask, which I would recommend if you're looking for more information on her work. But I say all this to say that it's not only artists of African heritage who can discuss and problematize work that has taken inspiration from Africa, and it's not only Oceanian artists who can challenge um, African masks or Oceanian masks also. Here we see Patricia Abad from the Philippines really commenting and wrestling with the use of the mask within European work um, here. And this quote pretty much sums up the complexity of the kind of conversation that we're having at the moment. Appropriation is sometimes an act of stealing, sometimes it's an inspiration, and sometimes it's a comparison and contract. Sometimes it's a negotiation, sometimes it's a marriage with a singular idea coming together to form a new idea. And that's a quote from Carrie Mae Weems, who is an African American contemporary artist. So, with all of these things, with Picasso, with Gauguin, it's really important that with every artist, with every artwork, that we consider the individual artwork and assess it according to what the person has said, what the person has done. Have they shown the due needed to African art, to Oceanian art? Um, how did they treat the people when they were alive? Um, in the case of Paul Gauguin, for example, um, the the horrendous things that he committed and did, that should also be taken into consideration, I believe, when looking at his artwork. Um, but it's important to, as mentioned with Patissa Abad, that sometimes it can be a marriage with a singular idea coming together to form a new idea. So it's not cut and dry as everything is appropriated or everything isn't appropriated. But it's really important to acknowledge and to also acknowledge if wrongdoing was done in the past in terms of colonialism and how the objects actually got to the countries where they were creating inspiration for French artists and British artists and artists across the world alike, uh, which is the repatriation process. So just wanted to finish now with a few places to visit. So there's a list of a few places across the world that have African masks and highlight African masks in their collection. I'd recommend before you go anywhere to just double check if there's something specific you want to go to see to make sure it's out on display. But it's everything from the Musée de Brani, which returned some of the Benin bronzes, actually, or are in the process of returning some Benin bronzes to Nigeria and to returning African artwork elsewhere. Um, there's places in Belgium, like the African Museum, which was quoted quite a few times in this presentation. But there's also places like the Museum of Black Civilizations in Senegal or Te Papa Museum in New Zealand that I'd really recommend as you're traveling across the world or as you're in your home city, just taking the time. We're um, more familiar, maybe more familiar with the work of Picasso or Gauguin or Derain or Modigliani, but taking the time out to look at art from the Dan tribe, to look at art from Congo, to look at art from Nigeria, to look at art from South Africa, and really see the artwork and appreciate the artwork and give it the platform that it deserves um, in our decolonized context. And I also recommend these Curious Muse videos. So if you're looking for a deeper another explanation, different explanation of some of these art movements. We have Cubism explained, and we have the primal roots of European avant-garde. That's not the name of the title, but that's the name of the thumbnail. So there's lots of different videos on the Curious Muse channel that you can refer to and be inspired by as you continue this individual journey into recognizing the art that influences Western artists, but also continues to influence people across the globe as they create art. Um, yeah, that has African Oceanian themes and represents the people today. So that is my my talk for you today. Please do put any comments you have in the chat, and I will look at them now. But it's been really great speaking, and I'm open for any questions. Opening my screen more wide so I can see everything. Awesome. So, as I just mentioned a few contemporary artists that have been inspired by Africa and Oceania and inspired and have been really problematizing Picasso and Gauguin and other works that we see. I really just gave a brief overview of Picasso, Picasso and Gauguin's work, but I encourage you to dig deep and to find out more about the different artists that are on display across the world. Cool. Mm. So, um, someone Fallen X100 asks why African masks and art usually brown and Japanese masks are different colors, um, and yeah, have different kind of motifs on them. So that's a great question, Fallen X100. I'll do my best to answer all of the different questions. From my understanding of art, I would say that it's because of the materials that they're using and the materials that are available. Um, Myself, when I've traveled to Africa, I've been struck by the different type of, even floor material. We just, for example, I live in the UK and I'm used to seeing lots of grey on the streets and seeing lots of concrete and things like that. Um, but in Africa, they have different types of clay, different types of work, and also um, much of Africa, people have darker brown skin also. So if you are portraying someone who is brown, then you're more likely to use the brown materials for that. Not all African masks are brown. We saw the one that was like half black, half white um, earlier, and some of the contemporary masks also, or contemporary African costumes that are used during ceremonies, things like that. I've seen like purple and green and lots of other different colors. But I'd say um, traditionally it's probably because of the material that they're made of, because they're more likely to be depicting someone of a darker skin tone. Um, yeah, I'd say those are the two reasons. Thank you for the next 100. That's a really great question. Uh, and also, you mentioned Japanese masks there also, and some of the Japanese masks you see really pale skin. You see like the really white mask with the really dark eyebrows. So it's like reflecting that culture as well. So there's another question that's does Nigerian cinema, so Nollywood, do you know if how African art influences the movies? Oh, I'm not an expert in any of these areas, but I'll do my best to hazard a guess. So uh, there's there's a lot of in Nollywood and in contemporary Nollywood. I only know more about contemporary rather than like 1960s or the beginnings of Nollywood. But I know there's a lot of reference to contemporary culture, um, as well as like village culture in there. So I haven't seen a mass of mass when I usually watch Nollywood, um, but I'd say all of the different art forms are really connected, and you see that in Nigeria through the Afrobeat movement and the Afrobeats movement that has come after then. So there's I wouldn't say that everything is disconnected. People grow up in a village or they grow up in the city. They grow up seeing the artwork. All of these things inspire them in the same way that Picasso went to the Trocadero Museum in 1907. We today still go to museums and see things, and artists still go to museums today, and galleries and other spaces, even within their own homes, see things and are inspired to create artwork. So I'd say it definitely does influence Nigerian cinema. And there is mention within Nollywood of different tribes or different kind of magic practices that are happening uh, as the story plot unfolds. So it doesn't surprise me. And also, there's a lot of mention of those kind of magic in Nollywood movies. And yeah, so I'd say it's definitely possible. Cool. Any other questions? Paul. If there's no other questions, I'm going to wrap up for today. Thank you so much, and it's been really interesting reading the different comments in the chat also. Um, Someone from who's Hawaiian, Crane Mythos, had spoken about the obsession of a place being seen as paradise, um, which is really interesting. Um, so yeah, it like keep on with those comments. There's so much more to explore. We spoke about Africa and Oceania today, but those are literal continents. So there's so many elements within there. Even within one individual country, there's so many different types of artists and groups who produce. So I'm glad that we could share a little bit of that with you today, and we look forward to sharing more with you from Curious Muse in the future. So thank you so much.